Tanchi, my name is Josh Carrier McKenna, and I live on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in so-called Vancouver, BC. I'm Métis. My family's roots run deep in Treaty 1 territory of the Red River Valley in Manitoba. My family names include Carrier, Hamlin, Vandal, Parenteau, Landry, Laurence, McGilvery, and the unnamed Cree women that populate my family tree. Today our guest is Daniel Voth. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary and served as the director of the International Indigenous Studies Program from 2019 to 2022. He is Métis from the Métis Nation of the Red River Valley. Raised in Winnipeg's inner city, Daniel earned his PhD from UBC in 2015. Daniel?
Hello. It is so good to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so psyched to be here. I love your intro and your positionality work there. I'm going to do a little bit of that myself. So for the folks who are listening and watching from home, I grew up, as Josh said, in the inner city of Winnipeg, which is like a place that remains very near and dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. My family grew up very close to our original script land, and we might talk a little bit about what that means, but it's essentially the land that my family received after 1870 in sort of an effort to deal with our native title to that place. And my family also stretches up into the Interlake region of Manitoba, which is this also really interesting place up the Number 6 Highway, Warren and the Woodlands and Lundar and all these really interesting places. And my family, I'm related to the Thomases at Fisher Branch. So Phil and Eileen are my mom's aunt and uncle. And Karen Fester Thomas also in Winnipeg too. We're related to them. And also the Hallets. So lots of Hallets floating around. Some people listening might know Heather Hallett, who's related to my family, who does a lot of really, really neat genealogy work. Heather wrote 2 books called the Children of the Rivers, People of the Rivers. And she interviewed my grandparents, my great-grandmother and my grandmother for that work in the 80s. So lots of really interesting stuff. So that's sort of the connection that I have to that place and some of the people that I'm related to.
For sure. You know, I think that might make you like one of the first Métis people I've met that might not be my cousin. So,
well, we haven't worked that hard. I mean, that still might be out there.
Yeah, well, we can do some digging. We'll see.
That's right.
Oh man, so today we were going to be talking about recentering women and queer folks, sort of in the historical and contemporary politics and culture of the Métis people. So I was wondering if we could just kind of get into the basics at first. I wanted to talk about how we made this shift from matriarchy to patriarchy, because we hear a lot that kind of like pre-colonization, our communities were built on matriarchal systems. But it seems like at some point there was a shift for the Métis people historically when we moved into patriarchy. Like, when did that happen? Why did that happen? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, that is just such a fantastic question. And there's a lot of different sort of factors that I think are at play. I'm going to lay out probably a couple of them that I'm really interested in. So one of them is also a bit of a challenge for Métis people in general. If you go to a Métis gathering, one of the things that you'll notice is everyone's kind of moving around the room being like, oh, I'm related to so-and-so. How are you related to so-and-so? There's a lot of genealogical work that we have always been really interested in about connecting families for a variety of reasons. One of the things that makes that work sort of interesting in this patriarchal world is we rely a lot on what has sometimes been called the historical motherlode, or the Hudson's Bay Company Archives in Winnipeg. I've been there. I've worked with those holdings, and they're fabulous. One of the things that's interesting about them is they are written from the perspective of European men, traders, the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company men are not actually that interested in the gendered world. They see the world largely through a very male-centric lens. And we can't really do much about that. So that has, I think, sometimes lent itself and sort of, what's the right word? It's sort of like sprinkled a little bit of patriarchy in our community in a way, because we go to that to get information a lot of the times, and so have all of these like intergenerational historians, most of whom haven't been members of our community. So they also now go to the HBC archives, and they sort of reproduce some of that male-centric lens. So all of the books that Métis people read about ourselves also seem to kind of carry that forward. So there's a lot of work, and some work was done in the 80s by a scholar, Sylvia Van Kirk, who did a fantastic job of trying to like break out of that mold and say, where are the women in these fur trade histories, in these Hudson's Bay Company archives? So we're working on getting out of that. The other thing that I think is also true is, as Métis people continue to have deeper interactions with the state, with Canada kind of demands that we interact with it in a particular way. And one of the ways that it's asking us to talk to it is through the language of men. We don't really want to talk to women. We don't really want you to go back and check with women about what we're doing and what we're agreeing to. We're all men in this room, we should be able to come to a decision. So that's the other thing that starts to happen, is the state demands in certain moments that we let go of the connections and the power that is deeply gendered and empowers women. That has, I think, been a really strong tradition of our people, but has been let go. And then the third thing that happens is, because of these kind of two and other factors, this HBC, historicization, very male-centric, but also the way that Canada demands it be kind of male-centric, we start to tell ourselves stories that are a bit male-centric. So one of the things that I've been interested in about is, what are the stories that I grew up with? Well, I grew up with stories about women who wouldn't take guff from anybody, and women who did not, to this day, women who will not be told. And that's actually a very common phrase in the Métis world. It's like, oh, she cannot be told. But that's actually part of our strength. But then what are the stories that I'm told in school and in university and in these books that I'm reading? Well, it's about Louis Riel. It's about Gabriel Dumont. It's about all of these men in the 19th century. My own family, William Hallett, that's the name that gets centered. The Brelans or Berlins, right? Pascal, all of these men. And then in the 20th century, we do that again. Malcolm Norris, Jim Brady. We go to these men, and those are the stories we start to tell ourselves. And then, finally, we start building statues to these guys. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. It's the wrong orientation, in my view. So that's where I think a lot of this comes from. It's a bit of a process that has us, I think, telling our own stories in a way that is eliding or hiding the power and the importance of women in our political systems.
So kind of one thing that I'm hearing is it almost seems like it's a little bit of a slippery slope where, you have these like resources in terms of like our history and genealogy that are very based in patriarchy. And because we're interested in that, we go to that because it's one of the only resources available to us. And then we're suddenly, next thing you know, like now we're just focusing on the men. And it's like, maybe that wasn't the intention at first, but now all of a sudden you're like deep into this patriarchal system without even realizing it almost.
Absolutely. And certainly, and I actually think it's true that there probably isn't an intent. That's the way these systems often work, is there's not really an intent to do it. There's just this thing that happens where say, well, that's, I don't know if you've heard or, folks have heard, someone say, well, that's just the way it is. Well, the way it is often deeply power-laden, and it's designed to make you think of the world in a particular way. And so what I've been trying to do is to say, we actually don't have, the way things are, we don't have to think about them that way. We can think about things in a variety of different ways. And I don't want to overstate, the men in our community are important, and that's important too. My view is just that we've got the balance wrong. And in doing that, that's had certain types of political consequences for our people and our community that we now have to kind of contend with, because there's folks like me and actually like your mom who are out there.
She cannot be told.
She cannot be told. I've met your mom. And, there's my mom too, my grandmother. My God, that woman, Irene Johnson, could not be told. And we have these women now who are in positions of power, and they are trying to shake up the table a little bit in ways that we haven't seen before. And so that's great. And so you're right. I don't think there is an intent, but the way that these systems of power work is they're kind of sneaky. You know, they're kind of sneaky in the way that they kind of shape the way you think what is normal, what is acceptable, what is common sense. And I think that that's one of the things that we're trying to shake up, and being like, we actually shouldn't really talk about common sense anymore. We should talk about what are the impacts of this? Who benefits, right? Those are the types of questions we should also be asking about the things about questions about how we live our lives and how we make decisions. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up that whole like common sense thing, because I feel like that is a very kind of contemporary kind of slogan that's being used by a lot of conservatives and conservative organizations as just like, oh, there's all this weird stuff happening, and like everyone's like exploring gender, and women are taking roles that are traditionally male and stuff like that. And it's like, come on, let's just be common sense about this. We don't need to have a critical discussion about this. Like, let's just fall back into the tradition that we're in right now.
That's
sort
right.
of. Yeah.
That's right. And so I think that, I would encourage, if anyone is ever, so the common sense piece has been a political tool on the right for a very long time. I think it was Mike Harris in Ontario who had like this he wanted a common sense revolution. Well, it's common sense, but why? Common to whom? Right? And why is this common? And so what the things I would encourage folks to say is, like, if someone's telling you that, like, well, we're going to do this because it's just common sense, that's actually not a reason. That's them trying to get you to believe without really asking yourself why you should do something or shouldn't do something. They're trying to get you to do something without you questioning it. And it's a shortcut, and it's designed to kind of, and in those moments, it frequently is intentional. Like those moments where I think is being animated politically, those tend, I think, I would be very suspicious about that, because what they're asking you is, could you just not think for yourself and just trust everything that I'm telling you and don't worry about it because it's common sense. Everybody else thinks the same way as me, and that's dangerous. We should not be embracing that. We should be encouraging people to think for themselves. It doesn't mean that you'll come to a different conclusion. You might agree with the thing that people are talking about, this policy idea, but you don't need other people to tell you that it's right. You can arrive there all on your own with your own rationale. And that's partly also the thing that I'm really trying to encourage Métis folks to do, is say, find this, trust your own ability to be able to analyze these things and to come to your own view on it, and then express that, but also be open to the other views that you're hearing, because those are also other views. Let's get rid of this common sense thing. It's not helpful. It's trying to shortcut away, and it's trying to get you to agree to something without actually having thought about it.
It's interesting how that's like common sense is like such a big thing in conservative communities, because it feels like kind of an oxymoron when you think about all of the sort of like independence types talk that is like brought up in those communities.
Libertarian thought.
Yeah, where it's like, from what I'm hearing you saying is that it's actually far more independent and encourages independent thought to reject common sense, whatever that is.
Absolutely. If you believe and this is a very Métis thing, but it doesn't have to be a Métis thing. If you believe yourself to be a free thinker, which our people have traditionally branded ourselves thusly, particularly women.
The people who own themselves, right?
People who own themselves, Otimsoak, right? The Métis Nation of Alberta just reformulated itself into the Otimsoak government, right? The people who own themselves. You could also just rename it the people who will not be told, right? That'd be another way you could do that. If you believe yourself to be that kind of person, you should be deeply suspicious of someone telling you should agree to something because it's common sense. And I would say that that's true for Métis people. But if you're not a Métis person, you're listening to this exchange, that's true for you too. If you believe yourself to be, and you want to live your life as a free-thinking person, you should not get trapped by common sense. You're perfectly capable of coming to your own rationale that may or may not agree with that, but common sense isn't the way you're going to get there.
So I think a lot of people would view kind of patriarchy as common sense,
Sure.
right? So let's bring it back to that again for a second. For the uninitiated, what is the difference between patriarchy and matriarchy, and why do we tend to hear patriarchy talked about as a negative thing and matriarchy as a positive thing? Because, like, you know, if you hear that and you're not really familiar with theory or anything, like, you're just like, well, it's just the masculine and the feminine, right? And, like, aren't they equal? Like, why are we? You're gonna get some people who are gonna go, you know, why are we hitting on men? You know,
Right.
like, and there certainly are people who are gonna jump on that train and milk that, right?
For sure. And I think that's a great question. So partly it's the way that we talk about archies, right? We have lots of archies in our world, and I'll break that down for you. So we got democracy, right? We've got, you know, polyarchy, right? The power of many. We've got patriarchy, matriarchy. We've got a lot of archies that are kind of like floating around. And one of the things that we're trying to point to with that is these are systems of power, and these are systems that create structures that determine who gets to make a decision. One of the things that we're trying to do with talking about patriarchy is saying there's a series of cultural but also historical factors, political factors, that we've handed over a lot of that ability to make a decision to men. And for a long time, for large chunks of Western civilization, you know, thinking about, you know, Canada and Europe and the United States, we've really centered that decision-making and politics was the purview of men. Women actually come into being political beings quite late in human history, in Western kind of contemporary human history. You know, there's a couple of moments where white women can vote in the empire early in the 19th century. I think New Zealand is early. But then, you know, it doesn't really get rolling until the 20th century. Like, there will be your great-grandparents, your grandparents will remember a time when women couldn't vote, right? That's how recent it is. And even then, the question of, like, which women get to vote, so those sort of things. So partly what we're trying to do with these discussions of matriarchy and patriarchy is to talk about, like, what are the structures under which people get to have power and make decisions. And we've really focused for a long time on that politics and the decision-making power is a man's world. It's a man's world. And there was a lot of work that happened through the 20th century and now into the 21st century in which we tried to shift that. For the indigenous world, we also were subjected to that. There's lots of work that's pointed out all over North America how indigenous peoples had structures that explicitly empowered women. So the Mohawks are a great example. The Cherokee originally had a women's council in sort of kind of American colonial times. Rebecca Tsozi has also talked about this. And we see the shifting of those structures into kind of obscurity and then non-existence. That what happens is all those places that women got together to make decisions that were like political and important and that only could be made by women, those structures get wiped away in the interaction between indigenous peoples and these incoming settler colonial powers. So Canada, what becomes Canada, what becomes the United States, those sorts of things. And so what we're trying to do there is focus back on, okay, so how do we make decisions that are empowering women, that, you know, reflect that women also have a political voice? And for me, my work is centered on trying to draw out some of the traditions that we have as Métis people that do that. I actually think that men have talked about making politics and making decisions in the 19th century, in like the 1870s and the 1860s. We talked about it in a way that was like kind of alluded to the fact that women were in charge. You know, the bosses were women, were moms, you were your aunties. Like they were the ones who were really in charge. We just didn't say it explicitly like that. It's the way that we structure grammar. It's the way that we actually organize meetings. It's the way that we did a lot of different, you know, engaged in a lot of different political activities that I think kind of give us some hints about what's actually happening behind the meeting minutes, behind the resolutions, that sort of stuff. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as matriarchy and patriarchy in my work.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, so I think maybe we could talk a little bit more about kind of how that became more prominent in our communities, because like it sounds like there was sort of like a lot of like the way that we started speaking or organizing, like even you're saying it's alluding to matriarchy, but it sounds like even in, you know, the late 19th century, we're like starting to move towards language that kind of like almost like seeks recognition from a greater patriarchal system or something. So do you think that perhaps that our communities becoming more patriarchal is a product of internalized colonialism?
It's hard to say. I think in the late 19th century, that's a harder claim to make, in part because we run the show up until pretty much 1871. The world in the Red River and sort of beyond in the West, right out here to the coast, in 1871, to my assessment, is an Indigenous world. We are the dominant power. Indigenous peoples are the dominant trade partner. We have economies that really are uninterested in large-scale partnerships with white folks and the products that they have available to them. I mean, there's some interest in that. Like, there's discussion in the 1860s about like how can Winnipeg become, you know, a grain exporter and stuff like that. But they're not that serious, right? In part because those aren't the economies that Indigenous peoples are engaged in. So that's not going to be the stuff that moves the needle. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense to think about these questions of like how patriarchy comes to be a component of our world at that point. There is something that starts to happen afterwards. And part of the thing that I think is when I look at the way that, so I'll give you an example. One of the things I've focused in on my work is this phrase that appears a lot in the 19th century that our people use, which is, we are the descendants of the original lords of the soil. Man, that's super interesting to me for a variety of reasons. First of all, we are the descendants, so we are the children of, have some sort of like familial relationship to. And then the second part, the original lords of the soil. Well, the original lords of the soil are not men from our perspective in that, right? That's what I mean about you actually have to, the common sense thing would be just to say, well, they're talking about some native man, the lords of the soil. You read it literally. That makes no sense. Our familial connections to all the other Indigenous nations that we're families in, that we're part of, that we have kinship to, like those connections are to women, are through women. And the simple reason is there are no white women having children in the Northwest at the time that people are using this phrase. It is not, it's an incredibly rare occurrence. It becomes common, but it's at the time that people are using that, they're not making reference to Native men or to white men or to white women. They're talking about Native women. Those are the people they are the descendants of, their grandmothers, their aunties. And so that's some of the stuff that I think that we have to do is like, okay, so what does that mean? They all knew, right? It was so obvious to them that it's not really explained. And so we have to do a little bit of work of trying to uncover what is the meaning behind this phrase, which pops up a lot in a variety of different forms and venues to assert an Indigenous connection to the land. And so what I take that to mean is, and then using a lot of the other oral histories that have been collected and published on, is women are the entity that links our people to the land itself. That's actually a maternal link. And I agree with Brenda McDougall on this, who wrote a fantastic book, One of the Family. And in that and her subsequent work, she said Métis identity is actually highly gendered. It's a gendered connection to the land. And I agree with her. And and my contribution is, I think that's how it happens. We think about ourselves as the descendants of the original lords of the soil. Those lords are women. And that's how this gendered relationship that's how it manifests. And what we've forgotten is how to make it do something. It's not just about saying it. We also have to then do something about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about how like the history of patriarchy rising to prominence and sort of the ways that it's changed our view on our history and maybe misrepresented history, where we're like very focused on historical men from our communities. But I'm curious to know more about how this is contemporarily affecting the ways that our communities function. Like, how are these affecting our kinship ties? How is it changing the way our communities interact with its members and each other? Is it causing us to function in a way that is worse than we used to?
Yeah, I love this question. And this is exactly the thing that, I have been working on and trying to figure out since I left Winnipeg. So for context, for people who might not know or not be familiar with Winnipeg as much, Winnipeg is like this really interesting space because what is conventionally called Treaty 1 territory is almost exactly the space that is covered by the original Manitoba Act. That is, we sort of as Métis people see as our building a relationship with Canada, with this incoming Canadian state, this country, in 1870. But Treaty 1 and the Manitoba Act are pretty much, sit right on top of each other. What this means is that there is a space that's really important to Métis people, to Saulteaux people, to Dakota people for other historical reasons, to Cree folks for also other historical reasons. We all have this like relationship to this same place. Mm-hmm. And so part of the issue that I've been really interested in is like, we politically have struggled to get along for decades, maybe even longer. Why is that? And one of the things that I think is happening here is that we've forgotten how to be good relatives to each other. And part of that is actually a gendered conversation about the role that women play in our politics. So as Métis people were asserting, we are the descendants of the original lords of the soil, which I think is super important. After that, we forget how to kind of relate to our families in those other nations. And those other nations then also forget and are told not to relate to us. So here, I'll give you a contemporary example. The Indian Act has been this massive burden on the Indigenous world for a variety of reasons. We often talk about it as like, well, it's a First Nations problem. That is a struggle or a policy document for status Indians and non-status Indians to duke it out and that sort of thing. That's their thing. That's not a Métis thing. We're not in it. That's actually not true. The original Indian Act expressly forbids the enrollment of half-breeds, which we then kind of go on to be able to talk about as Métis people. My family actually still talked about ourselves as half-breeds until it was like socially uncomfortable to do so. But like that's certainly the language that's used by a lot of Métis people about themselves, but also the state looking at us. If you are a Métis person or a half-breed, you are not party to the Indian Act. We have there's something else that will manage you. So that's right in 1866. Or 1876. 1876 that occurs, and it creates this like ring. It's like throwing a big stone into a lake, and these rings start coming out through time. And to this day, we still think about all the differences that animate Métis people and status Indians and non-status Indians. Whereas we've lost the ability to see ourselves as related to each other and as part of the same struggle and as having political relationships with the same places and the same pieces of land. And instead, we see each other as adversaries, as threats to each other's political world and resources. Oh, criminy, the resources fights that we have with each other. Here's a great contemporary example. One of the famous cases from a few years ago was Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada and Manitoba. The bare bones of the case are, in 1870, the Métis are promised 1.4 million acres of land. Did we get it? And the Manitoba Métis Federation would like the court, after viewing the evidence, to declare that that did not happen, that we did not get the land that our people were owed, and that that's a problem. There was actually no land to be exchanged. There was just a declaration. That's what the MMF, Manitoba Métis Federation, wanted. The thing that I was most interested in about that case is who intervenes. In a court case, you can if you believe that you have some sort of interest in the thing that the judge is going to be deciding, you can apply to the court to be invited to make a submission as an intervener. That's the phrase that's used in courts. You could be an intervener. Well, who intervenes but all of the Treaty 1 First Nations led by the Chief of Peguis? Peguis First Nation is a large community, just up the road from Fisher Branch, where my family's from. It's like 15 minutes just up the road between Fisher Branch and Peguis Reserve. And so, what do they say in their intervention? They say that Métis people should not be found. Let me back up. They say that if the Métis have any rights at all, those rights are, and this is a direct quote, subservient and inferior to the rights that the Treaty 1 First Nations have. That if Métis get anything from this, whatever it is, must be declared by the court to be subservient and inferior. And I thought that was such a strange phrase.
Yeah.
To be subservient and inferior, you just use essentially two words for the same bloody thing.
Adding insult to injury there.
Yeah, 100%. And it's also this kick in the nards.
Yeah.
And it's saying just in case you don't know what subservient is, your rights are inferior to ours.
Yeah.
Right? And their argument is that we, as Treaty 1 First Nations and the descendants of the people that signed Treaty 1, are the true Indigenous people of this place. And Métis might have rights, but they're sort of like a fraction of rights from the ones that we have. That's what... Now, my uncle was shacked up before he passed away, on Broken Head First Nation. My Auntie Rose Bear came to my sister's wedding. We are related to these people, to these signatories, to these people who are Treaty 1 Indians.
Yeah.
They're in my family. And that's what their political organization says about our land claim case. Or it wasn't a land claim case, but our court case to try to point out that we didn't get what we were owed and what we had negotiated. Holy Hannah. That is and that didn't happen 100 years ago. That happened 10 years ago. Yeah. Right? We're hiring lawyers to fight each other in court because we have forgotten that we are connected through our mothers and our aunties and our grandmothers. And if they had their way, and if they were still alive, some of those women, I am sure that they would get us in a room and they would crack our heads together and say, "What are you doing?
Yeah.
You've screwed this up."
Yeah.
I honestly believe that is what those women would say to us. And we are picking fights that are hurting both of us. It would have been a completely different world if the MMF, and I don't actually know that this didn't happen, but to imagine a world in which the MMF files this case, and maybe Treaty 1 intervenes, but they intervene on our behalf, right? They intervene as relatives to this fight. That didn't happen. They intervened as competitors because they saw our claim. And this is a direct quote from their factum, from the submission to the court. For every land that the Métis might get out of this, even though we weren't asking for land, every acre of land that we might get out of this is necessarily 1 acre less to satisfy the claims of the Treaty 1 First Nations. So we're no longer co-governors of this really important place that we all have a deep emotional and spiritual connection to. We are now competitors. For everything that we get, that necessarily means that they get one less. That's called zero sum, right? If I have something, that necessarily means that you have nothing. And that's the political world and the reality of what us forgetting that we are related, and the women and the way that the women would teach us about how we're related this is the result of it. This is what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a mess.
That sort of competitiveness too, I feel like really positions Canada as like the true owner of everything. It kind of positions the country and the government as this sort of hand that feeds, and we all just compete against each other. And
absolutely. I think you're exactly right, Josh. And here's the other piece of this. Who benefits the most from us picking fights with each other?
Mm-hmm.
Canada does.
Yeah.
Canada does. Right? They're able to sit back and say, well, honestly, let's just let them go at it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just let them go at each other for a while, right? Because that means that we don't actually have to do anything because they're too busy fighting each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same problem. We've all lost our lands.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same problem. And now we're fighting each other for the scraps?
Mm-hmm.
We've lost perspective on this.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the thing, and this is one of the things that I'm working on in my new book, is we have to somehow have conversations with our First Nations relatives that their intergenerational concern with firstness is part of the problem, right? And that's an easy thing for a Métis person to say because all of the stories that First Nations people believe are the wrong story about their relatives. That like we are partly Native.
Mm-hmm.
We're not partly Native. We are Native people.
Mm-hmm.
We are Native people. And there's lots of First Nations peoples who are post-contact peoples. Like we're not the only ones.
Yep.
And we've lost, and so we have to be able to kind of find new ways to talk to our relatives about the damage that these narratives of like, we came first, therefore you must come second.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true. That's also really actually kind of buying into all of this racism that has hurt their own communities. Like it's just, it adds up layer on layer on layer of real significant problems. But it is the dominant way that a lot of, particularly chiefs of a particular generation, think about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to find new ways, and that's what I'm working on. We've got to find new ways to have this conversation with these folks because we're all losing. Mm-hmm. Everybody loses. And we've got to turn that around.
Mm-hmm. That sort of competitiveness is kind of falls into something that I've been talking about on some of the previous episodes of this podcast. And that's just the kind of willingness to embrace short-term solutions for long-term problems. And it's hard not to do, right?
Yeah, it's super
because like when you see your people suffering and stuff like that, and you can get some money or some land real fast, that could, you could see like real world positive repercussions from that for your people, then it's hard to say no to that and actually hold out for something more important. Like you see it a lot in some of the First Nations that have actually ceded their territory.
Yeah.
It's like, they become quite rich nations right now, but in the long run, your land's gone.
Absolutely.
But it's hard to hold out for those long-term things when people are suffering, right?
Absolutely. And, it's real easy for me, and this is a fair critique, and people should level it at me and say, it's real easy for you, Daniel, to talk about this. You and your ivory tower at the University of Calgary and going to Winnipeg and working with your own community. And, it's really easy for you to talk about that. There is some significant suffering that all of our peoples have, and you want us to put it aside for something that might exist down the future, down the road. Man, for anyone on the prairies, you know that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Mm-hmm. Which means you got to take what's right in front of you, mm-hmm. right? Without hoping that they're going to get something better down the road, because people are hungry now. People are hurting now. People are homeless now. Mm-hmm. And that is a fantastic critique. And so I don't want to overplay. But what I think we also have the ability to do is to think about, yes, we have politics of the immediacy, of right now things need to change. We have those. We also have politics of we need fundamental intergenerational change to the way that this is happening. I actually think both of those things can be strategized together, and we might actually get more. We actually might get those two birds mm-hmm. instead of the one mm-hmm. if we think carefully about how we are going to try and get it right now. Can we work together right now to get both of us, not only one bird each, but could we get two birds each for First Nations folks and for Métis folks? Mm-hmm. Also, I want First Nations folks to get what they are owed because they are my family. I want that, and I want to help do that. And I also want Métis people to get out of the way when we are the ones who are trying to stand in the way because we're too busy asserting our own nationalisms.
Which we certainly are sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have a piece on this about like Métis people in the Calgary area need to be way more thoughtful and careful about the way we conduct ourselves. In my view, that's not our traditional territory. And if we go about being bad guests there, that's a real pain and a real damaging presence for the Blackfoot and the other signatories to Treaty 7. And so we've got to also be careful about that. It's not just about, status Indians, First Nations folks, play nice with us. It's also, we got to play nice with them. That's also a key component of what I think is required in our politics, and we need some coordination. So yes, those are political problems of the immediate, and I support that. Can we answer some of those questions where we're not sniping at each other and we're acting in ways that, even if it's not something specifically for us, it's something that we can also support them getting, right? To build this cycle of reciprocity in which we are with each other in this god-awful fight, right? People are hungry. People are homeless. People are sick. And we've got to pay attention to that. Can we do that in a way where we're supporting each other? And I got one other theory thing that I'm going to throw at you. Howard Adams wrote in 1975, divide and rule is the most basic of colonial practices. He also wrote, the other one that's really important to keep your eye on is the state telling you or forcing you to engage in your problems as if they're only local. Do not get overwhelmed by the local framing of your problems. You've got to be able to see them and make tough decisions, but also aware that these local problems are part of a larger program of land dispossession. And he was right about both of those things. And that's the other thing that kind of I'm trying to take to the next level of, okay, how do we do that? Because it can be done. I think it can be done.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to the need to just have solidarity between our communities all across Turtle Island, and to really be pushing for more kind of like leftist revolutionary action, because the embracing of these short-term solutions really speaks to the problem of liberalism and just this trickle feeding of like little solutions or band-aids over bullet wounds, as they say, right? That we are just like forced to just take what we can get, sort of thing, that ultimately is weakening us in the long run, causing us to lose our sovereignty and self-determination. But the thing is, we can't afford to wait, right? And that's why a sort of revolutionary fast action is necessary. But we have to get organized, and we have to get educated, and we have to get together.
I agree. And we've got to also, I agree with you. And I think that there's a space in thinking about these different forms of political engagement that we can plug into in a way that's really supportive. I'm not actually, one of the things that I find interesting about Howard Adams' work, so just for folks who might not know Howard, I know you might have talked about him.
Every episode.
So if you're new to the Sickle and Sash, Howard Adams is a Métis political activist, cut his teeth in Saskatchewan in the 30s and 40s, and goes on to get a PhD and becomes a professor and writes this amazing book in 1975 called Personal Grass. And he takes on like a kind of a modified Marxist perspective on these sort of things, and he plays with Marxism in interesting sort of ways. But the thing that I think is really interesting about that, moving past it, is I think that if you're not a Marxist, or if you're not interested in revolutionary politics, the things that we're talking about are still good, right? There's still things that you can plug into. So we are trying to build these networks of solidarity, but that also, in my view, cross over and reach out to people who are politically different than us, right? That maybe they actually are really thoughtful and have interesting ideas about dealing with the immediate. We might not agree on everything, but there's got to be a space for us to be able to disagree in a way that we are not undermining both our causes. We've got to be able to find the ability to do that. And that's a key component of what I'm trying to do. I have tried to develop a reputation of a guy who can work with anybody.
Yeah.
I used to work at the Manitoba legislature, and I really did believe that was the role that we should be trying to encourage people to play, is someone who can say, yeah, I don't like that, but let's try and figure out about something that I do like that we can work together on because we'll both be ahead. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of the other kind of political task that I see for ourselves. And I don't think that people who come from a different political orientation, who are, perhaps a bit more centrist or right-wing or more market-oriented, don't be afraid of questions of like solidarity and collaboration. Like I don't want to also make this a purity test. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a purity test in which you can only be part of this thing if you think these things. We need people. That got us into this mess in the first place.
Well, the left famously eats their own.
Oh,
right? So.
Man. And that came out of an NDP. I worked a little bit for an NDP government. And that government famously defeated itself multiple times in Manitoba. And all the Manitobans will remember, Jim Walding and these other big names. The fight over Greg Selinger, the last time they ripped themselves apart because some people were not pure enough. Oh, we got to be careful about that, because then we are right back where we started.
Yeah.
We are right. And I've seen it, right? And I'm not saying that because I can see it in the future. I can see it in the past, right? I've seen the movement do that to itself. And what good did we get from it?
Yeah.
And for Indigenous peoples too, I think that that's true. There's a number of different ways that people come at this. And like I said, chiefs of a particular era, they see firstness. That is their ideology. And they're protecting their people with that ideology and their history and their culture. And I see why it's important. We've got to have a conversation about how we come past that, right? And that requires us all to be open to change and to think differently about things.
Mm-hmm. Well, to kind of wrap this back into our initial discussion about patriarchy and all that, I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on why women have been left out of the narrative, but it feels like that's kind of already been answered by it seems like it is a specifically targeted thing in the colonial project to leave women out of the narrative because it kind of destroys our relationships and our ability to relate to one another. So I feel like that kind of answers the question for that already. But I do want to get into where queer folks fit into this whole thing, because patriarchy certainly leaves them out as well. And since you bring up Howard Adams too, we don't have to jump right into it, but the first work of yours that I read was pointing out his failure to to recognize the role of queer folks and women in his work. It's tough to criticize one of my favorite books, but you have to still, right? But yeah, maybe we could just get into generally where queer folks have been left out of the narrative as well, and then maybe get into the stuff about Howard.
And hey, I want people to criticize the things that they love. I think that that's one of the greatest forms of love you could probably give something. You don't have to be mean. I tried really hard not to be mean about these sort of things. Yeah. But I think that people watching this and listening to this, you should criticize me too. I'm open to this, and I'll learn something and you'll learn something. That's a really important component. We've got to be open to these things. Yeah.
What we're saying isn't common sense. It can be thought about.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. This is not common sense.
Yeah.
You got to figure out if you like this for yourself.
We're nuts. We don't know what we're talking.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. But for Howard, I tried to write that piece as a let me take you back to my days. Actually, we're doing this recording in the Buchanan Tower, and I did my PhD one building over in Buchanan C Block. And a theorist once said to me, Mark Warren, I was taking class, I was a PhD student, and I said, I really want to engage this particular theorist. It was Jim Tully. I said, but I don't really disagree with him. He said, Mark said, well, maybe what you want to do is you want to engage this as an appreciative critique. And I'm like, oh God, that's exactly what it is. I want to talk about what I like about it, and I want to try and see if I can push it further. And he said, yeah, that's what we call an appreciative critique. And I love that. So I really wanted to try and approach, when I took this up much later after I was done that class and I got my own job, and I wanted to take that question up in an appreciative sort of way and put Howard in conversation with the other great mind that has shaped me so significantly, which is Maria Campbell's work, which came out before Prison of Grass. Her fabulous book, Half-Breed, was 1973. And so the thing that I really wanted was to put them in conversation with one another. And so partly what I'm trying to get at with this is we can't just rely on sort of the daily sort of machinations of the things we're reading to bring in new perspectives. We actually have to do that ourselves. And I'm guilty of this, partly because I got to the end of writing about Howard Adams and his bad treatment of women and Maria Campbell's much more robust understanding of the gender dimensions of colonialism. And I was like, oh, I didn't really bring in queer people, you know? And as like a gay man, I'm like, oh, I guess that's a bit of a failing of mine, but you can't do everything all at once. So there is new work that I'm trying to think about, which is also difficult in how do we find queerness in the archives, in our politics from the 19th century. I spend a lot of time thinking about politics from the 19th century. In our politics in the 1960s and 70s, which is when the Manitoba Métis Federation was formed. In our politics today, my one of the women who raised me, Barbara Bruce, is a very well-known and famous advocate for queerness in the Métis Nation, and has been an advocate for that. But also the MMF now has a queer local, has a Two-Spirit local. Like, things are changing. So how do I, in my analysis, bring those perspectives in? I'll give you one little thing that I'm working on. This isn't actually ready for prime time, but it's something that I'm working on. So you get a little bit of a sneak peek at it.
This is a Sickle and Sash exclusive.
That's right. Sickle and Sash. You will find this nowhere else.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, or sorry, in the 1860s, the United States is going through the Civil War. One of the things that happens is the British Empire gets a bit nervous about it and says, well, to kind of, our territories in British North America, what is now Canada, they might be in threat. They might be kind of under threat, depending on who wins that war, that Civil War in the States. And so they engage in a short-lived troop surge. And one of the things that they try to do is they bring in a whole bunch of British soldiers from the continent. And one of the folks that they bring in is a guy named Dunmore, the Earl of Dunmore. So Dunmore is this interesting guy. He's been dispatched by the British Empire as, I think he's a Lord Lieutenant in either I can't remember which, one of the Fusilier Guards or one of the other divisions of the British Army. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So he's out there and he goes on a little vacation to Red River. And he takes with him a whole bunch of other sort of lordlings. One of them is a guy named Alfred Tyne, and then a couple of Coopers, two brothers who are Coopers. And those are also they're spare sons of other lords in Europe, in Britain and Ireland. One of the things that's super interesting about this is it's hard to figure out what exactly happens, but there is some sort of interaction between some probably Métis trader on these guys and one of these lordlings. And it looked to me like Alfred Tyne had developed some sort of relationship out on the prairies, potentially with this Métis trader, and they run into him. Essentially what they're doing out there, what this Dunmore's party is doing out there, is they're on safari. Like, they are just heading out and killing buffalo and killing anything that they can see, racking it up, putting it in a cart. Some of them, I'm sure they're not. And they killed so much that, like, one of the notes that Dunmore makes in his log is, like, we had a hard time sleeping last night because the wolves were howling so much. Well, the wolves are there because you've created essentially this, like, moving smorg, like, just, like, across the prairies, like the smorgasbord. So that's how much they're killing and just leaving behind, which is interesting in and of itself. But one of the things that they run into this potentially Métis trader, I don't actually know for sure, who sells them whiskey. And the next morning, Alfred Tyne disappears from their party. and it was noted that he had gone back for whiskey. Like there is like, and I thought to myself after I read that, like through the entire log, Dunmore sort of beating up on this guy as like not a very good hunter, kind of giving the sense that he's not particularly manly. And then all of a sudden he like ducks back out to hang out with this whiskey trader. Like I've gone back for whiskey too, you know, like I think I know that might actually be an intergenerational statement for what he was trying to say.
Yeah.
You know, and so there are these moments like that's a European queerness, but it has the potential to like be, I think a little bit about the work that my colleague, Josh Whitehead, is doing on like making love with the land, thinking about what man, you know, the land is super queer, you know, and like there's other scholars, Billy Ray Belcourt's thinking about that too. And so I'm trying to think about, you have to bring that lens in differently in the same way that I couldn't read, you know, the original Lords of the Soil. I couldn't just read the words and be like, well, that's what they say. That must be what they mean. That wasn't good enough. There's something else behind there because the words themselves make no sense. I had to bring something in order to kind of figure out where women are in this. I think that's also true of queerness in the archives, queerness in Métis history, queerness in Métis politics. We don't always use the words directly for a variety of reasons. And so one of the things that you have to think a little bit about is like, in what ways can we bring in something to help us make sense of what is this really about whiskey? Like, you know, because man, this doesn't make a lot of sense here. Like maybe it was about whiskey, but like it forces you to ask difficult questions that ultimately, as Winnipeg historian and Manitoba historian Jen Brown once said, you know, these people are dead. They've been dead for a long time, and they refuse to answer our questions. And that's frustrating. But we do still have to kind of be careful about not just running the same textual analysis that we always do. We've got to be open to bringing in new forms of analysis to see these things that are not going to show themselves normally or naturally. We have to kind of look differently at them in order to see them. And we have to have different methods in order to get at them. And so that's the kind of stuff, that's this little tidbit. Like I said, it's rough, but that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on to try to bring in exactly that analysis of queerness, you know, to be able to see these sort of things. One other thought on that is, because we used to think about things or do things in a particular way, doesn't mean we have to still keep doing them. We talked about queerness in a variety of different ways that in some senses, in some moments, were really damaging to our community. We let go our own kin because they were different from us. And that we were poorer for that. Our people were poorer collectively for that kind of behavior. I think about this Wawate Fobister in his fabulous play, Agukwe, in which he says, the Anishinaabe do not waste people. And and that phrase is right. That phrase is correct. We should not be wasting our own people, which means that even if we can't find queerness in the archives in kind of a definitive way, that doesn't mean we don't take the lessons we've learned about women, other sorts of related forms of relational forms of governance, and reimagine them today, right? So I've talked a bit about, you know, if we were really thinking about women as the original lords of the soil, we should be thinking about, like, you know, the Métis Nation, maybe, yeah, sure, you could think about women's committees, but maybe there's actually a legislative body that is for women exclusively. And that is the place where we make final decisions on land use. That's where we go to remove our political leaders when we're not happy with them. It's an accountability body. But maybe also that space is not just about women. Maybe we also think about, like, that's a gendered space, and there's a lot of different gender that's represented in those sorts of political bodies, in those institutions or in those chambers or that sort of thing. So what I'm saying is we can think creatively and broadly about the way that we empower gender thought of broadly in our political lives. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I was gonna ask you more about how you envision kind of like recentering women and queer folks in terms of Métis nationalism, but I feel like that kind of answers the question a bit there. You know, because I feel like that sort of thinking is like actual structures that are kind of like matriarchal and queer, as opposed to just simply being representation, right?
Absolutely.
Because representation is fantastic, but it's like it's not the solution to every problem.
I agree.
Right?
And you can cook representation in a way that it's not empowering.
Mm.
And that's the trick, right? The trick is not to just this is the thing about nationalisms, and this is true of Métis nationalism, and I think of Indigenous nationalisms broadly. We can get caught in saying these things. If you ever Don Martin Hill, fabulous scholar at Mac, brilliant scholar. And she was the one who clued me onto this. And she said in this really important work that she wrote, how many times have you been at a Native rally and you hear some Native man up at the mic talking about, the sacredness of women in the land. And she's like, these men are really problematic. They treat women like very badly in many cases. They talk the talk. They don't walk the walk. They're not accountable to women. They don't treat women with the respect and the empowerment that they deserve. So it's not just about saying these things. It's not just about these nationalist symbols. You've got to have. I'm an institutionalist. I think institutions matter. I think that I think that the way that you build and design institutions shapes their outcomes and matters. I think that we can build institutions that are revisable over the long term, that can be changed themselves, that change the way change who and what we empower. And so part of the reason I think this is because the Métis also were very interested in institutions. In 1870, we were concerned about what does the legislature look like? Who gets to vote? How many chambers are there in this legislature? Is it like the House of Commons, or is it like Parliament in which there's a House of Commons and a Senate? There's two chambers, or maybe there's just one. We cared about those questions. We should continue to care about them. And we can build these institutions in a way where we practice these politics of empowerment. We practice the politics of empowerment. And I think that that's what's the task is now, is that we're pointing all these things out. Now we've got to do something. So let's think about realigning the way that we make decisions here. And it means that some people at the top of organizations are going to have less power. But that means that power is going to be balanced off in other ways that I think we will be collectively richer for. And so we also need leaders who are open to that, who are open to those types of conversations about, decentralizing some of their own power. And that's a tough conversation to have, but it's also one that we need. I
think your point about building institutions is like a really important one there. Because I think we also have to come to terms with that some of the institutions that are in place already are just not reformable,
right?
And that just sticking Indigenous people and women and queer folks in positions where they weren't, in structures that are inherently problematic, is not going to solve the problem. Like it's this sort of thing that you hear all the time. Quite often you hear, we need more Indigenous cops, or we need more queer cops, or we need more women cops. And it's like, now we're just self-policing. We're just doing the work for them. Like that's not solving the problem. The problem is the structure inherently. So yeah, and I'm not really opposed to institutions outright or anything either, but I think building our own, and with these things in mind, like specifically building institutions in which we can recenter women and queer folks from our community, like within the foundations of these institutions, is like just a key thing that I'm taking away from what you're saying here.
Yes, I agree. And it allows us to have far more interesting, even if you don't like them, at least the conversations are going to be far more interesting about how we make decisions about ourselves. And I think that's an ongoing thing that we should be trying to do. I want to be on, there's a paper out there somewhere that, I advocated for like more Native people in Parliament. I don't think that anymore. And part of the reason I don't think that is because in my interest in institutions, I forgot that institutions themselves possess the ability to co-opt, to change, the orientation, that those institutions also have a logic that they are protecting, their own reason for being. Parliament has a reason for being. And I had forgotten at an earlier stage of my career that is, in some cases, quite hostile to Native people. And I want to, give credit also to one of my mentors, Glenn Coulthard, who talked a lot, who tried to point that out to me at an early stage. And I tried to defend it a little bit and saying, no, it would be better for, imagine there were 10 reserved seats or 20 reserved seats for Indigenous people in Parliament. And it's like, well, man, I don't know that that's going to work that differently. They're still living in this really messed up institution that its job is to keep things going the way they are. That's its job. It's not really that interested in asking questions about itself, asking questions about how it makes decisions, asking questions about how could it be less colonial. It's not interested in those questions. It's interested in keeping on. And that's part of the problem. So we do need our own institutions that I think are distinct. And the ones that we have, the MMF, AFN, Union BC Indian Chiefs, Reformed, and all these different political organizations, we also have to be engaged in an ongoing question of interrogating those institutions. Do they continue to serve us? Because that they served us in the past is not an indicator that they serve us today. And we have to ask difficult questions of those. And the answer might be yes. The answer might be kinda. The answer might be no. And we have to do this work to be able to ask those questions to see, okay, what needs to change? Does the whole thing need to get thrown out? I don't actually think that there's anything wrong with that. If you're finding that these native institutions that we've been trying to create aren't serving us, or do they need to get changed? Okay, in what way? And using what information do we use? Do we pull in to change them, to reform them in a way that's more reflective of the new way of thinking or the updated way of thinking, of dealing with these with our challenges today? So yes, institutions are a bit of a double-edged sword. But I think that they're still important, and I do think that they matter. And we have an opportunity. And the answer is not to create the perfect one. The answer is to create one that reflects our values and is responsive to us.
Yeah.
That's not perfect. That doesn't mean there will always be agreement. There will be lots of agreement. My goodness, have you ever been to a Métis gathering in which there wasn't significant political disagreement? That is part of our tradition.
Yeah.
And to celebrate the women who are agitating and who won't be told, that's a key component. That's also part of what we have to celebrate. We're doing it right if that's what's coming out.
Yeah, I think an important thing to be aware of too when dealing with institutions, and even what you were saying with some of your older ideas of just having reserved seats in Parliament for Native people, is to reference Howard Adams again, you got to think about who is going to be selected to fill those seats. And it's that whole concept of the co-opted Indigenous leaders, right? Which again is one of the issues with representation, right? But I think building our own institutions is key here. And like you said, interrogating some of our institutions that we've already built. One of the key issues that I have with all of our different provincial Métis institutional reps is that they identify with the province that they're based in.
I agree.
And it's right off the bat, it's calling something Métis Nation of British Columbia or Métis Nation of Alberta, is kind of weird. I get that you're operating within people who are dealing with the circumstances of being colonized by this provincial government, but you are just associating with it. And it's weird, right?
I agree. I'll tell you a quick story about it. I left Winnipeg with a MMF card in my back pocket, same as my mom, same as my grandmother, same as my auntie and my uncle, my cousins. We all did. We all joined as soon as we were able. And so I got here and I thought, well, that's fine. I'll just show MNBC my MMF card and they'll just give me one of theirs. That surely that's how, because I looked at their membership criteria. It was the same as obviously what it was in Manitoba. and I grew up in what they refer to as the homeland. Like, I am from the capital of the Métis Nation,
Yeah.
essentially. Like, this should not be that difficult. Nope. Start again. You apply from scratch as if none of that had been done correctly. Well, okay, fine. So I did. And then I moved to Alberta. And then I said, okay, here, sure. Well, now we're back on the prairies where people are sensible on the prairies. I'll go to them and I'll say, here's my card. I have an MMF card. I also have an MNBC card. And they'll just print me a new one. They'll just print me an MNA card.
Just collecting all of them.
I'm going for the full house bingo, baby.
Yeah.
Like MNS and Ontario, and I've got the full house bingo.
Oh, yeah.
Nope. MNA did not want to do that. I reapplied from scratch. Had to do it all over again. And I thought, there's something wrong here, right? I get the desire to want to be autonomous in certain ways. I get the desire that these things can and have in the past by community organizations been used as revenue sources. I absolutely get that. That's an important thing too. There's got to be a way that we can see ourselves across provincial lines as part of a larger political collectivity. And what became clear to me is there's a lot of infighting between the different provincial affiliates.
Yeah.
Particularly right now. And the Métis National Council for a long time, I think, was seen by a lot of folks as an arm of the Manitoba Métis Federation, and that has now changed. I've met the president, Cassidy Karen. I saw her at Batoche. We hung out. She seems really cool, but she sees the world differently than some of the folks at the MMF, and so that's created new tensions. And it's also driven the MMF to rebrand itself as now we are the national government. And okay, folks, there is a moment in which we all have to kind of reckon with, is this helpful? Is this helpful? And I feel like there's a lot of territoriality and turf warring that's happening here that I feel like, again, some of the women in our lives would get us into a room and just clack our heads together and say, figure it out. This is not helpful, and this is actually not, this is not doing what you think it is. It's not you asserting your self-determination. This is you just picking fights in an unhelpful way. Yeah. And so I think there is space for us to think a bit more thoughtfully, to be a bit more thoughtful about how we engage some of these questions of belonging and membership and political organizing and that sort of thing. And I don't think we're doing it. But it requires longstanding leadership to be open to change and to open to the criticisms that are being made by, in particular, the youth. From the founding of the MMF, this is also going to be new work that's coming out in this book that I'm working on. In the founding of the MMF, the people who said we should not do this, we should work with our status Indian brothers and sisters, was not driven by the leadership of the day. It was driven by youth. Youth were concerned about this. And we've lost that wisdom. And so there's an opportunity here for us to learn from women. That's the head clacking, but also from youth and being like, we need to work together. That's the stuff. Those are the views that I take to be quite inspirational in my work.
Totally. Just thinking about that, all the different provincial groups butting heads is just, makes me think, bringing it back to the discussion of us not even being able to get along with some of our First Nations cousins. Yeah. It's like, how can we expect to get along with our First Nations cousins when we can't even get along with ourselves? And I think it's maybe speaks to, again, what we were talking about earlier, and just forgetting how to be relational with each other and having these very patriarchal, hierarchical government systems that we have in place right now that just are totally missing the point. And how are we supposed to decolonize if we're going to still be working within those systems?
I agree. I think that there's also a space for us to have a thoughtful criticism of our use of settler law. We pay lawyers a lot. Now we have a whole group of brilliant, accomplished Indigenous lawyers who have come from their communities and gone to universities and gone to UVic and all these really important programs, come to UBC, U of C. We're training our own lawyers. We have to be careful. Again, law is an institution that has its own logic. I have never been compelled by the argument that we can just inhabit these things and have them work for us. I don't see the evidence that this has been working. And in fact, in my work, I've been highly critical of our desire to want to hire lawyers to solve our problems. Well, we'll just sue. That's actually, in some senses, making it worse. The British common law legal system is designed to create adversaries. It's an adversarial system. It's not a system that we would have ever used to solve our own problems. And we turn to it and we pay these lawyers large amounts of money that their expertise demands. Their expertise demands it. I'm not saying that they're not experts. They are experts. But it's, again, we're not having the question, what are our values? And is this serving us? And there has to be a collective will among our leadership and among the next generation of leadership to want to back away from that. Lawyers have an important role to play, I think, but we've used them to just batter each other and thinking that that's what self-determination looks like. It's not. It's making it worse. And in my work, I've published work in which I lay out precisely the way it's making us poorer, right? Not only financially, because we're having to remortgage buildings and try and do fundraisers to pay for these lawyers, which again, they are owed the money. But in addition to that, we're just lining up against each other in all of these things. And we've lost the ability to kind of think about how do we want to fight these fights? Because I actually think that the how is more important than the end result. I am a believer in the work of Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard and others, Matt Wildcat, who think carefully about the means that you fight are actually more important than the ends of the battle itself. How you fight, in many respects, in their view, and I think this is compelling and has borne itself out in evidence, how you fight creates the world you inhabit after the fight is over. And I think, and also builds community in the process of fighting, right? I'm not sure that we're doing, I don't see the evidence that that's what's happening when we're hiring lawyers to go after each other. And so these lawyers are fabulous, they're brilliant, they're very good at what they do. Are we being served by it?
You know, if we are able to actually achieve some sense of solidarity, I think the means by which we fight, and one concept that we explore a lot through this podcast, and that I've learned a lot from Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson, is kind of this employment of Indigenous Marxism in that. And of course, we say Indigenous Marxism to mean, at least on the most basic level, a form of Marxism that accounts for land sovereignty. But I think in employing that as well, I was wondering what your thoughts are on how we can intentionally recenter women and queer people in sort of an Indigenous Marxist action, because, anybody who's read anything of Marx knows that he's not always the best when it comes to women and queer people. So indigenizing that sort of political theory, how can we also, understand indigenizing to mean bringing women and queer people back in as we decolonize that theory?
I think part of it is, that is an excellent question.